I'm very excited and honored to introduce Emma Goldberg. Emma will be talking about how COVID-19 has changed the workplace. So let me introduce Emma to you. Emma is the Future of Work reporter for the New York Times. On this beat, she has published numerous articles on the impact of COVID on employment, including pieces on the reticence of some workers to return to the office, the difficulties of implementing a hybrid work model, and the effects on remote workers of having no clear boundaries between home and work lives. Prior to joining the New York Times, Ms. Goldberg wrote for the Washington Post, The Economist, The Daily Beast, Elle, Glamour, The Forward, ESPN, Salon, the LA Review of Books, Vice, and USA Today. Ms. Goldberg earned her bachelor's from Yale University in political science and a master's from Oxford University in gender studies. Emma, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you, and I apologize for my background. I'm at my brother's graduation, so I was looking for a space where I could get good Wi-Fi. But I am really thrilled to be here with all of you and to get to talk a little bit about this work, and also to hear your questions and your comments and ideas, because I think one of the things that's been most interesting to me about covering the workplace has been just the kind of dialogue that gets sparked when I ask people about the way they work. Because I think no one has been spared by the sort of totalizing changes that we've experienced over the last few years. And so a lot of people have emotions about it, have thoughts, have responses. And I think we're at a really interesting juncture right now in which a lot of decisions are being made about what work looks like going forward, whether it's, as we were just hearing, in the gig economy, or, for office workers, or really across all different industries, especially at this moment when we're again seeing COVID surging and trying to figure out how to keep workers safe, even as businesses are running. So I'm really excited to be here with you all, and mostly want to hear all of your questions. And I'm just getting the screen share going so I can pull up my presentation. I want to just kind of start out by, a lot of what I cover is return to office issues. And it's interesting because a lot of times when I tell people I cover the workplace, the immediate responses I get from a lot of kind of readers and people that I cover is, oh, what do you think is going to happen with offices reopening? And so what I think is really important as a starting point for any of these conversations is to actually think about, who has actually been working from home, and for whom has the workplace not really, changed as fundamentally during the pandemic because they've had to be working in person all along. So I think it's important to kind of start out with the numbers and proportions of who's in the office, who is not. And so that starts with, in May of 2020, that was really the peak of office workers being at home. And at that point, just about 35%. Oh, and we can advance to slide 3 here. Yeah, perfect. 35% of people were working from home. And so it's really only, even at that kind of peak of lockdowns in the US, it was only about a third of US workers actually were teleworking because of the virus. And this is really great data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been collecting since the start of the pandemic. So I think it's important to contextualize that number, because on the one hand, that's a huge leap in terms of how many people were teleworking from before the pandemic. On the other hand, it means that 2/3 of American workers were still going into their workplaces, working in person, and exposed to the risks that came with that in many different ways. So I think that's important context when we think about how people were most affected. And I think within that, it's really important to look at also the kind of breakdown by education level, as well as the breakdown by race. So 60% of people who have a college degree were teleworking. On the other hand, for people with less than high school diploma, only 5% were teleworking. So you see that it really breaks down pretty heavily along the lines of how much, how educated people are, what degrees they have. And if you had less than a college degree or less than a high school degree, you were far more likely to be working in person, especially early in the pandemic when lockdowns were at their peak and when workplaces were really not exactly sure or not really well equipped to keep workers safe. And I included the racial breakdown as well. It's 35% of white workers were teleworking, 29% of Black workers, 23% of Hispanic workers, and 52% of Asian workers. And when we think about, again, that question of where are people working, who's returning to the office, really fascinating that, there are a lot of media narratives and a lot of narratives in general right now, a lot of social media about people working from home. On the other hand, as of March, so 2 months ago, only 10% of workers had teleworked at any point during the month because of COVID. So it's really just a tiny slice of the American, working population. And again, that far overrepresents, it's about, a fifth of people who have a college degree and only 1% of people with less than a high school diploma. So I just wanted to start that out because I often get the response to, to my coverage saying, can we talk about how many people have not been able to work from home? And that is really much of the population. And I think it's also important to note that the federal government and, workplaces' ability to protect people has been really hampered, particularly by state laws that restrict the type of vaccine mandates that can be put in place. And also, OSHA, the Labor Department's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, had a pretty sweeping vaccine rule that was rolled out in November that actually required either COVID vaccines or weekly testing for workplaces with at least 100 workers. And then that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So now workplaces are really limited in their ability to mandate vaccines. And from the reporting I've done, I've found that just a very, very slim share of workplaces have mandated vaccines. So for people who are going into their workplaces, there's a lot of risks that are attendant with that. And can we move to the next slide? So then I wanted to zoom in on what the experience has been for people who are working from home, because I think that is one of the areas during the pandemic in which we've seen some really fundamental sweeping changes to the workplace. And so I included the statistic pre-pandemic, just 4% of US workers worked exclusively from home. So a really, really tiny share of the population. And then you saw that in May 2020, it was about a third of workers were working from home at some point, which is a pretty massive leap. And so I think when we think about who started working from home and what did those changes mean, I always think it's important to ask who had the highest stakes in that kind of massive shift. And I think there's a number of groups that have really benefited from the shift to remote work, but I wanted to zoom in on a couple of groups in particular. So one is caretakers, and I interview a lot of working parents, a lot of people who, have kids and family at home that they're taking care of, or older generations as well. And that's one group that I think had a really massive gain to be made in being able to work from home. Because, I think when you think about who the office was designed for, it was designed for someone who has another person in their family, in their household, who's at home taking care of everything that they're not able to be home taking care of, whether it's cooking dinner, taking care of their kids, picking their kids up from school, running a household, basically a full-time job. And those are all people who all of a sudden were able to fit their work more flexibly in with their lives during the pandemic. So it was really a massive shift for caretakers. And I was really struck by him. I interviewed Joan Williams, who runs the Center for Work-Life Law. And she talked about remote work as this kind of massive experiment that people had always wanted to try and had never really had an opportunity to do so. They didn't really have ever have the opportunity to prove that it could even work. And what she told me was the only thing holding back flexible work arrangements was a failure of imagination. Because people, just said, how could we even make flexible work work? How could bosses know that people were getting their work done? How could companies trust that the output would continue when the input of just kind of hours put in, people sitting at their desks wasn't there. And that failure of imagination basically was remedied within 3 weeks' time in March 2020, which is, without bosses even really having to buy in. They just ultimately got the proof is in the pudding in terms of remote work actually being able to work for people. The other group of people that I wanted to really zoom in on is employees of color and office workers of color. And there's really fascinating research, particularly from a group called Future Forum that's backed by Slack that studies knowledge workers. And they found that Black knowledge workers are far more likely to prefer working remotely over working from the office. And when we did a call out as well to about to readers of the Times, and I got 700 responses from people about the benefits to them of working from home. And I really did find an overwhelming majority of Black knowledge workers said that they preferred working from home because they were able to avoid some of the microaggressions, the cliques, and the other, cultural challenges that they experience when working in offices. So I think there's a lot to be unpacked there, and one is that offices have to be made to better accommodate, workers from all different demographics. But it also shows that when we talk about flexibility, the stakes are particularly high for workers of color and for caretakers. So we can move to the next slide. So I think when we think about why did it take so long to try out remote work? Why did it take so long to try out, flexible work where people can spend part of the week working from home or, figure out a little bit what works for them in terms of going into the office part-time, working from home part-time, going into the office for part of the day. It seems like so obviously something that would benefit working parents and working caretakers and, like I said, knowledge workers of color. So I think it's important to ask, like, why had that never been tried? And there's a couple of things that come up, and those are, I think, also really the sticking points when we think about why are managers so intent on getting people back in the office. So one is, I think it's about control to a certain degree, that when managers see their workers in the office, they know the work is getting done. They can just look and see a person, one of their employees at their desk working away, bent over their computer. So there's, a little bit of trust that just doesn't even have to be built up. It can just, you can see it. The trust doesn't have to be there. You can just know that the work is getting done. So that's the fears about productivity. Another is fears about culture. And here's, I think, where managers really do have a set of challenges to wrestle with, which is the fact that for early career people in particular, there's a certain degree of mentorship and just of relationships that get built up in the office that are much more challenging to develop when people are working from home. So that's the fears about culture. And then lastly, the fears about creativity and collaboration. And that's to some degree, I think there's this mythic idea of the run-ins, the water cooler conversations, the kind of creative spark that appears when people are in the office. And to a certain degree, that's also real, that, people do cross paths with someone in the hallway, or they eavesdrop on a conversation at a desk near them and hear about, ideas going on, and what's kind of, brimming on other teams, and they can pitch in. So there are real opportunities for creativity and collaboration that I think get sparked in the office. And offices have had to do some real work to figure out what can that look like in a remote setting. And so we can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit of what I touched on, but this is when we did that call out, we got 700 responses to how people felt about working from home versus working from the office. And a couple of the things people said is that they were able to, strike a real new degree of work-life balance. They have more energy to give to their family, to other things in their lives. So some of the pros that were raised of working from home were flexibility, autonomy, trust, focus, and then on the downsides of the office, less exposure to microaggressions or cliques. And we talked about some of this, so we can go to the next slide. So I think when we think about why flexible work made such a big difference to people, it's important to ask who the office was designed for in the first place. So the first ever real open plan office in the US was the SC Johnson Wax office. It opened in 1939 in Racine, Wisconsin. And it looked like, the kind of office that so many people work in today, where it's big, it's open, it's airy. Instead of everyone, in their own little separate rooms, you can actually see everyone around you working. You can bump into your boss, you can bump into your colleagues. And so I think it's important to ask, like, who does that design benefit? Because at the time when that first open office plan opened, women made up under 1/3 of the workforce, and their labor force participation was far lower than it is today. And it jumped, it jumped up pretty dramatically in the decades after that for a number of reasons that, importantly, I've written about recently, one of the reasons it jumped up was also Roe v. Wade and access to legal abortions. People were able to plan out their families more, and so they were able to kind of build their careers more, and that boosted women's labor force participation. So at the time when these early modern offices were designed, women made up a much smaller share of the people going in and using them. So the people who they were set up to serve was, someone who could be there under the watchful eye of the boss until late in the evening, because they didn't have to run out and pick their kids up from school or cook dinner for their family. So they were able to, sit there until late in the evening and be observed by their supervisor. And they were also able to maybe cross paths with the boss. Another thing that probably is more likely to benefit men, often white men who, look like their supervisors and want to have those random chats about golf or about whatever it is. So, it benefits people who look like the leadership in the offices. So when we think about, why women and why workers of color benefited so much from remote work, we have to remember that the office itself was actually designed for a workforce that's not nearly as diverse as the one that we have in the office today. So we can go to the next slide. And that was just that early office. You see the big airy space and people being able to, wander around, bump into each other, be observed by their boss. We can go to the next one. And this is, what that office looks like today. And this is an office that I visited this fall where young workers were just starting to go back into the office. And it's interesting because you see that open plan concept at work, which when you think about it, it can be challenging once you've gotten used to the productivity of working from home, of having your own space. Then suddenly you're being pulled in with all these perks like mini golf, but you don't have like the work-life balance that you benefited from at home. So what a lot of workers are starting to say is, the office was designed with all these perks, like mini golf, like snacks, things like that are supposed to make you emotionally invested in the office. But what some people end up preferring is actually the emotional investment in their homes and in their families, and being able to have a more of a balance between not feeling like the office is home so much as that their office can be balanced with the time and the investment that they put into their homes. We can go to the next slide. And another, I think, sort of interesting change that people have experienced as they've started working from home is the ability to design a schedule that works with those caregiving needs more. So there was really interesting research from Microsoft that found that people's work days used to have two peaks of productivity. They would have a peak of productivity before lunch, and then they would have a peak of productivity in the afternoon after lunch. And now that people are working from home, there's actually a third peak in the workday, and that's around 9 p.m. So they're calling it the triple peak workday, which means you're getting your work done in the morning, you're getting your work done in the afternoon, then maybe you break, you make dinner for your family, and then you're able to make up for some of that time in the evening. And I think there's real pros and cons to this. One of the pros is that people are able to go pick up their kids from school or spend more time with their family. The afternoon looks a lot more flexible and fluid than it used to be. Some of the cons are that, a lot of people have experienced far less of a boundary between their work day and their home life, because once the workplace was upended, the work day got upended too, and the schedule. I think a lot of people realized that the time they'd allocated for work was really tied in to their workplace and having that physical boundary as well. And there's research from Microsoft also showed that the average Microsoft Teams user sends 42% more chats per person outside of the traditional workday now. So there's been, a really big leap in people, on the one hand, building flexible schedules, on the other hand, maybe struggling more to differentiate between the time they spend working and the time they spend on their personal life. We can go to the next slide. And this is just, I think, another important aspect to consider is, I think when we think about what investment executives have in the office, there's a certain aspect of management that is tied to observation and to really, keeping close tabs on your workers. Well, this is someone named Frederick Winslow Taylor, was a researcher who turned management into this kind of science. It's now understood as Taylorism, which is the idea that you can really measure the time people are spent working and turn that into like a science rather than just kind of trusting the work will get done. And when people pivoted to remote work, there had to be a certain degree of trust that just cropped up. The idea that if bosses saw the work getting done, then they had to just believe that workers were putting in the hours. So that's a kind of trust that has built up as people have been able to design their own workplaces and work days more. We can go to the next slide. And I think as we're thinking about what return to the office means, we're thinking about how can we keep some of that trust that was built up during remote work, and how can we keep some of that flexibility, some of that fluidity, because I think bosses have realized that when people are able to design their own work days, they are often happier and as a result more productive. We can go to the next slide. So I think one really fascinating dynamic in terms of, and this is both within the debate over return to office right now, but also it's a factor just more broadly in the labor market, which is, what's been dubbed the Great Resignation. But I think recent, some recent pieces I've worked on and some recent data that's come out has called that narrative into question a little bit. So it's important to start out by saying, first of all, that it's a really tight labor market right now. This number is actually updated. More than 40 million people quit their jobs last year. And the reason that the labor market ended up being so tight and that workers have had so many options is that there was this sudden stimulation to the economy. Vaccines rolled out, economic stimuli came out, the government, both federally and at a state level, was urging this kind of return to normal. And as a result, businesses really wanted to hire all of a sudden. So workers suddenly had a lot more options. And what's fascinating is that about 40 million people quit their jobs. Most of that was people actually quitting and then switching to jobs they liked better. So workers were moving in between jobs, in between industries, looking for better paid opportunities, looking for opportunities that allowed for more flexibility, for retirement accounts, for all sorts of other benefits, better healthcare. Because they had options. And so they were in some cases saying, if their jobs weren't paying them enough, if their jobs weren't treating them well enough, they were able to walk away. And we can go to the next slide. So again, as I mentioned before, that Great Resignation narrative being called into question, it's actually been more of, I think, a great reshuffling. Some people have called it a great rethink or a great renegotiation, which isn't so much people questioning their relationship with work in general, so much as them questioning what they expect out of their jobs. And it's been an interesting, a 0.9 correlation between people quitting their jobs and people switching their jobs. Actually, even a little bit above that, a 0.91 correlation. And this has been really concentrated among leisure, hospitality, and retail. So in leisure and hospitality, the rate of workers quitting rose from 4% before the pandemic to nearly 6%. In retail, it jumped from 3.5% to 5%. So you're seeing really big leaps in those sectors where workers have really been on the front lines of the pandemic in different ways. We can keep going because I know we're heading toward the moment for questions. And what happened when people quit is they were able to get better options. They were, wages grew tremendously in leisure and hospitality as a result of all that quitting. So they grew 15% in leisure and hospitality, and wages grew 7% in retail. And the rates of people working part-time involuntarily also declined. So people experienced just tremendous benefits as a result of having far more options in the labor market. We can go to the next slide. And when we think about how those wins are being sustained, a lot of that is coming from the push for unionization right now. And, right now, under 11% of American workers are represented by unions, but we're seeing a really interesting union drive. And in particular, we're seeing support for unions is at a really high level culturally and socially. So support for unions is at its highest that it's been since 1965. It's at 68%. And we've seen that in, there's a massive push right now at Starbucks because they've hired a lot of young progressive workers, and those young progressive workers are now pushing to unionize their stores. And there's been some huge wins on that in various, the Elmwood store, and in there's a drive right now in Pittsburgh. All across the country, you're seeing some company-owned stores starting to push for unionization. There was also obviously the big union win at Amazon last month at the warehouse, which was just led not even by so much of an organized labor push as by individual workers who built up the leverage themselves and did the organizing and had cookouts and served barbecue and just took their own frustration with how they were being treated and translated it into a push for sustaining the leverage they built up. And we can go to the next slide. This is also you're seeing even in white collar industries as well. The Nonprofit Professional Employees Union grew its membership from 12 organizations and 300 workers to 50 organizations and 1,300 workers. And they've been doing a lot of pushing around return to office, because whereas in some other sectors, you're seeing unions really focusing on pay and on benefits, in the white collar world, you're also seeing a big conversation within unions around return to office policies and around that push for increased flexibility. So I know we're at the kind of zone for questions. So I want to make time in case people have questions about return to office, about also the Great Resignation and job switching. So I see one question. Have you?
Yeah. Emma, I can help you there.
Oh, great.
Thank you so much for making your presentation and making this possible with the circumstances that you have. And we really appreciate the time that you've made to talk to us today. So let me start by kind of driving down into the great reshuffle. And it's pretty clear that there's a lot of job switching happening. And whether that happens remotely or it's people that have returned to the office, it's kind of all part of that mix. But in your research and interviewing of people, do you have a sense of what are the things that are pulling people to other organizations? What are the characteristics that they're looking for that's driving this change in how employers are responding post-pandemic?
Well, so the overrepresentation, the real concentration of people switching jobs has been in retail, hospitality, leisure. So those jobs where people were on the front lines of the pandemic, were being underpaid, did not have sufficient protective equipment and safety measures. And at a certain point, a lot of them, were fed up and looked for opportunities that were better paid or that were safer. Some switched industries, some switched just businesses because they didn't feel that their managers were taking proper steps to keep their workplaces safe. So that's where you saw the concentration of job switching. I think in white collar sectors, hiring and the labor market has still been really tight just because the economy is doing really well. It kind of picked up tremendously early on in the pandemic as vaccines rolled out, as economic stimulus rolled out. Businesses all of a sudden had to hire a lot. So the labor market was really tight. So even in white collar industries where the quitting rate hasn't been as high, workers still have a lot of leverage as a result of the conditions of the labor market. And I think those conversations you're seeing geared a lot around sustaining the flexibility that was built up during the pandemic. So Apple is a really fascinating example of that, because Apple has called its employees back to the office. They said 3 days a week. And then there was this massive resistance from within the workforce, where Apple workers wrote an open letter saying, several open letters actually saying, we don't want to go back to work. And they wrote this pretty stunning open letter saying, stop trying to control us, because you've seen that we can get work done from anywhere. And really high profile Apple employees have actually departed the organization over the return to office policies. And as a result, you're seeing some back and forth. And actually this week, Apple announced that it was going to tweak its return to office policies and just require people to come back for now 2 days a week as opposed to 3 days a week. So you are seeing the company be pretty responsive to the demands of its workers.
Right. And we're seeing that one of the critical things about remote work experience is that people have learned how to be productive away from the mothership.
Exactly.
And the greatest advantage of being at home is having that autonomy. So one of the things that's being discussed is how do we add more autonomy when people come back to work? And it's been articulated as how many days they're going to have to come back to work. And if that formula doesn't work for a person, they look for a company that can meet that need. But are there other things that you're picking up in terms of when they go back to the office where autonomy can also be reinforced, not just what day they show up, but what do they do at the office? Are you finding anything around that?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the things that's interesting is that companies right now are at the juncture where they're trying to decide how kind of rigid should our return to office be versus how much can we embrace the fluidity and the flexibility that developed in our working norms over the course of the pandemic. So for example, one question is even like, how many days a week should people come in and who gets to pick which days? And, a lot of companies have tried to prescribe, you can come in Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, because a lot of companies are worried that if they don't specify which days people come in, then when people go in, they won't bump into their coworkers and they won't really realize the benefits of being in a workplace in the first place. On the other hand, I think companies have realized that there's certain kinds of work that are really well suited to an office and certain kinds that are really well suited to being kind of flexibly located. So companies are differentiating, I think, between soft and hard work, for example. So soft work being kind of meetings and conversations and more kind of collaborative things versus putting your head down and really focusing on writing, on research, on reading, which is the kind of thing that can happen best outside the office. So you are seeing a lot of companies arrive at the place where they're realizing they might have to let workers dictate the terms of when they come in and how often and which days, because it's up to workers to figure out where they do their best work and to differentiate which kinds of work they do on what days. So there's more and more, I think, kind of power being ceded to workers as companies realize that that it doesn't work that well to tell workers, you have to be doing this kind of work on this day.
Right. And one complication of, letting people decide when they're going to come back and therefore kind of putting boundaries around which days they're coming back is that the one thing they missed when they were working remotely is all those relationships that they had, their friendships and having more of a social life with people they worked with, as you've reported. So when there's a lot of uncertainty about who's going to be in the office when, then you've got a new problem, which is people will show up and they won't see the people they want to see. They won't see their boss. They won't see their friends. They won't see the people they need to talk to. And so are you seeing anything around that, curating groups of people coming back at the same time where it's very important for them to affiliate? Are you seeing any of that trend happening?
Yeah, you are. I think the biggest concern right now is around the stakes for early career workers who really need the mentorship that comes from the office and also the social relationships. That's actually something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about recently is like, what's the value of feeling emotionally invested in your workplace? And I think on the one hand, there's a lot of pushback to the idea that you should have an emotional attachment to your workplace, because a lot of workplace experts and labor experts are saying, ultimately at the end of the day, you should feel comfortable advocating for the wages you need, advocating for the flexibility, the benefits, and the emphasis on emotions kind of interferes with that, or can serve as a distraction from workers really just advocating for themselves and their own financial needs. On the other hand, I do think that there's a real benefit for young people to going and feeling a sense of community and mentorship. And I think you're even seeing some companies start to experiment with really interesting models where they're embracing permanent flexibility or permanent remote work, but then finding ways for workers to convene, in offsites, or even, meeting up and kind of retreats every so often, so that they still have ways to connect, even if they're not going into the office. So for example, Airbnb just announced that it's going permanently remote. But I think they're starting to explore what are some ways that their workers can come together, not in the office, but in offsites or in retreats or in other ways where they can bond, without actually that bonding being tied to a physical office location. And Airbnb, of course, has a very financial stake in people being able to, work from anywhere, work from vacation, work from homes all over the world. So they've been really kind of on the forefront of making that push.
Yeah, and have you also seen some trends in co-working space that are located in neighborhoods or distributed, where people would have a very short commute or no commute at all, so that they can have an office setting but no commute to convene? Have you seen anything there?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's a big question hanging over co-working spaces right now, because of course, the WeWork implosion was right before the pandemic. So I think there's been a big question mark over what the future of co-working looks like. But on the other hand, cutting out commutes has definitely been one of the major benefits of remote work. Especially with inflation right now, a lot of workers that I've interviewed have said that one of the biggest concerns about returning to the office for them is the cost of gas or the cost of commuting. And then on top of that, there's the time associated. Americans used to spend about like 27 minutes each way commuting to work. So that's like an hour of your day that could be spent with family, or could be spent on, taking care of yourself in other ways, on cooking. So commuting and the cost associated with it is a big question, and a big concern that's also kind of casting a shadow over return to office plans.
Yeah, so it's important to kind of look at the big picture of all these different moving parts. And we have one question about whether you've looked at how gig workers are not supported sufficiently in their companies during COVID, and ways to support them better. Do you have anything to say about gig workers and how that might fit into this picture?
It's a really, really important point, because I think one of the most critical issues that's come out over the last few years, over the last 2 years during the pandemic, is that the people who our society are most dependent on are also the people who often have like the least layers of protection when push comes to shove. Like early in the pandemic, when a lot of office workers were able to go start working from home, the people who they were dependent on to deliver their food, deliver their meals, keep their cars running, their Ubers, or their all their other kind of day-to-day needs filled, were also the people who were the most exposed to COVID. So I think that's just like a point of tension that's really come to the fore during the pandemic, is that the people that we depend on most viscerally also have the least protection, and have the least investment in their protection. And that's something that I think is really critical to continue putting to the forefront, especially as we're moving forward into the next phase, when it's becoming really clear that COVID is not going to go away, and that we're going to need to find ways to keep workplaces safe over the long term, especially leaning into frequent testing, masking, other boosters, and other kinds of safety mechanisms.
So one last question, and then we'll let you go to the graduation. So what do you think the leverage that employees have and this new understanding that employers have about the value of their people, as they've experienced shortages and problems with employees during COVID. Do you think we're moving towards better work and better working conditions? And if you do, where are we headed? Where do you think we're going to end, since you've looked at the future of work?
I think that's the biggest question right now, because I think we're in this kind of extremely unique moment in which it feels like, at least like for a fleeting moment, workers have leverage. The labor market is really working in favor of workers. And some of that is being translated into gains on wages, as we've seen in leisure, hospitality, and retail. It's being translated into wins on flexibility, as we've seen for office workers. It's being translated into wins just in the labor market more broadly, in terms of workers being able to walk away from jobs that aren't serving them and find ones that are safer or better paid or more flexible. I think the question is going to be, if we head into a recession or if the dynamics of the labor market shift, how do we concretize that leverage and concretize those wins? And I think the drive for unionization is probably the most obvious answer to that, because when workers are able to formalize those connections and formalize that leverage, they're able to make those demands even when the labor market is no longer tilted in their favor.
Excellent. Well, we'll stop there, and thank you so much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you so much for bearing with me. I'm so sorry. I was looking all over for a quiet place, and this is the quietest I could find. But thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, for bearing with me. And I'm always welcoming story ideas and questions. So my email is open to all conference participants who have things that you think should be covered on our Future of Work beat.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you.